Now, with that done, I would like to look at a fairly famous case in this world in the area of AI ethics and life and death. So it's certainly emotion AI ethics as well. This experiment is a version of what is called the trolley problem. That's that's something you could Google, but we are going to come at it from the point of view of a web page called themoralmachine.net. And what happens on this web page is you are confronted with a set of scenarios in which you must make the following decision. A car is pictured, as you see here on this slide, and the car is an autonomous vehicle, so it's driven entirely by AI. More, this car is a futuristic autonomous vehicle, so there is no steering wheel. There is no way for the drivers to retake control of the car. The car is truly and fully autonomous. It is directed entirely by artificial intelligence. There's no human decision that can be made. The machine will decide everything. So, what happens in this scenario? In this scenario, the car is going down the road, and unfortunately, the brakes fail. The car cannot stop. So, the car is headed toward an intersection, as you can see, and there are people in that intersection. Happily, or not, depending, there is also on the road a concrete barrier. So, the car can choose, the AI can choose to do one of two things. It can continue going straight ahead, and in that case, it would run into the people in the crosswalk. And for this thought experiment, we will assume it will kill those people. Or, alternatively, the car can deviate from its path and run into the cement barrier. In that case, the car will, in fact, kill the occupants of the car. Now, of course, it happens that in the real world, when thinking back to when I was younger, like many of us, I took a course in driver's education to get my driver's license, and we talked about lots of things. I remember in that class we talked about what to do when in a stop sign, what the different road signs mean, how you can park and not park, and so on. But one thing we never talked about at all was this kind of scenario. Um, Part of the reason, I suppose, is because we don't want to put people in positions where they would be forced to take their own life. Um, Part of the reason also is that in the real world, this scenario would, of course, be much more complicated than this, and things would happen so quickly. It generally can be very difficult to hold individuals accountable for any kind of decision that they would make. Again, things would happen so rapidly. The probabilities of killing people or just injuring them would need to be calculated. And it's hard, it would be very difficult, I believe, in most cases to blame someone for doing something that would be considered wrong when, again, an instantaneous decision must be made with almost no information. However, the situation is different for a driverless car. It's very different because we can plan for these things beforehand. It's not just instantaneous. We can actually program directions into the car for as many different scenarios as we can think of, right? So we don't have, humans have the excuse that we did not plan for this because we didn't know what was going to happen. And it all happened so fast that we couldn't really decide anyway. For an autonomous vehicle, that excuse does not exist. If you're going to work at Tesla, let's say, and design an autonomous car, you have a responsibility to define what the car will do with the information it has. Uh, And you can do that, and you must do that because you have time to think about it. I mean, you have ample time, quite a bit of time. Right now, certainly, there are computer scientists and ethicists sitting around at Tesla imagining exactly this scenario and imagining what they would tell the car to do. Should the car kill its occupants? Should the car kill the people in the crosswalk? Now, this decision can be made, can be weighed in many different ways. Uh, for example, what would happen if there are a family of four people in the car, and there's only one person in the crosswalk? You might say in that case that perhaps the Tesla autopilot would be right to conclude that the car should continue through the crosswalk, killing that one person, but saving the life of four people. It seems like this would be a good initial way to start to think about the way a driverless car might be programmed to make this kind of decision, simply in terms of numbers. If you can kill either one person or four people, well, you kill one person. And this would trace back to the initial case we talked about in the hospital emergency room. This is really just another form of that case. But what happens if the situation becomes a little bit less clear cut? What happens if it's one person in the car who would die and one person pedestrian in the street who would die? Now, let's imagine that the person in the street is a 95-year-old person, very near the end of his life, and the person in the car is a 25-year-old person just beginning his or her life. Would that difference in age influence the decision you make as a utilitarian or a consequentialist? Again, here in terms of the first choice, the first mathematical choice, how many people die? That answer is 1 versus 1. So that doesn't help us. Now we need to choose which person will die when it's one or the other. And we could sort of raise the stakes. I think that many people, if the choice is between a 25-year-old person dying and a 95-year-old person dying, uh, they would choose the 95-year-old. Though other people might say, no, we should still flip a coin. To those people, I could say, well, I can raise the stakes further. Let's say that the choice is a 95-year-old person in the car and just a 9-month-old baby who had crawled out into into the crosswalk. In that case, would you really believe that we should flip a coin if the choice really is between a 95-year-old person dying and a 9-month-old baby dying? Shouldn't we choose the 95-year-old? Or even if then you insist we still flip a coin, even if in that case it's not enough, we could say, well, what if the 95-year-old was just about to have a heart attack and is going to die in 10 minutes? Now, in that case, if the 95-year-old is going to die in 10 minutes, then wouldn't it be better to have that person die now and save the life of the baby who's only 9 months old? I think that most people are going to come down on the side of saving the baby in that situation, though you do not need to. Remember, for the ethics of dignity, one aspect of dignity is that all humans have it equally. So if you fall back to that ethics, you could say, look, every life is equally valuable because it has equal dignity. So even in the case where you have a choice between a 95-year-old who will die anyway in 10 minutes and a baby, you still flip the coin. But for all of those, and I think this is most people in my experience when I talk about this in my seminar, for all of those who say, no, if it's a 95-year-old who's going to die anyway and a baby, then I am going to save the 95-year-old, excuse me, save the baby and have the 95-year-old, the car, drive into the cement barrier, and that kills the 95-year-old. That makes a lot of sense. I think many of us intuitively would agree with that. One important aspect, however, of that decision is that once you start saying that one life is worth more than another, then it's hard to see how that stops, right? As soon as you take that first step, I'm not sure how you could not take subsequent steps. Or stated again, repeating the main idea, once you decide that some lives are worth more than others, then it's hard to not decide that. So if you take the baby over the 95-year-old, then what about the 19-year-old over the 80-year-old? Or the 40-year-old survives and the 50-year-old dies? It just seems like you're stuck having to make decisions. Now, what I would like to do is I would like to think about that. What kinds of decisions would be made within a very specific scenario? I would like to imagine that you work at Tesla and you work in this autonomous driving division. And you have just been with me and you have conceded that you would save the baby before the 95-year-old who would die anyway. And then you have been forced by simple argumentation to say, okay, therefore you believe that some lives are worth more than others. And you've already said that by saying you would save the baby before the 95-year-old. You've said the baby's life is worth more than the 95-year-old's life. Once you've done that, then given the kinds of tools that Tesla has, which would be cameras in their car and quick access to the internet, maybe almost instantaneous, how should Tesla program their cars to make decisions in situations where somebody must die? And I think where that leads is here. It's here toward the need to make a kind of algorithm that takes the information which is available from the camera and more or less gives a score of the value. Well, doesn't more or less, it does give a score of the value of that life. So, for example, the simplest score that we talked about would be for a life would be you could give a score for age. You just say the life of a young person is worth more than the life of an older person. And you could render that algorithmically to render a score in terms of what someone's age is. Right? So that's a simple start. And could you do that with the Tesla cameras? Yes, sure you could. Right? I mean, a camera, at least in many cases, could give some rough estimate of a person's age. I mean, just looking at my face, you see I have a white beard. If you see that, then you know that I'm probably 50 or up. Yes. And so that the camera would be able to grab that information and plug it, some kind of age approximation, into an algorithm which would give a value for my life. Let's say the camera says, I am somewhere between 50 and 60, so it takes 55. That will convert into 45 points for my life. And then the other person who might be chosen to die, that person would be a younger person. You could see their hair is blonde and shiny. So the tool imagines that this person is about 25-year-old. That would convert into a 75-point score for their age. And so if the choice is to save me, 45-point person, or them, a 75-point person, that's bad news for me. The car will hit me and not them. So we've now taken two steps toward making this driverless car decision. The first step was we said, look, human life itself is good. And so if you could kill two people or one person, then the car should probably make the decision which kills only one person and saves two. That was one decision we made. But the second one we're making now is far more subtle and significant because the second one is literally about rendering the value of human life of a particular human life in numerical terms and how you can do that legitimately. And concretely how you can do that with the information you can get from the Tesla cameras and connection to the internet. So let's think of some other possibilities. We've said age. Another possibility that the people raise sometimes in my seminars is they say, well, what about if the people are about equal age, but what if one of them is smoking? Um, the Tesla cameras should be able to see that someone is smoking a cigarette. Should that point decrease the value of a human life? It does make sense because smoking cigarettes does tend to lead to shorter lives, right? Heart disease and lung disease and similar. So maybe you can say, look, if you have two people, they're identical in every way, but one person is a smoker and the other is not. Well, then the smoker is the person who should not live. Or again, what if you have two people who are identical in every way, but one person has a family and the other one does not? Maybe the Tesla cameras could work well enough and quickly enough when a choice has to be made to do facial recognition, find out the names of the two people who could die, the driver of the car and the person in the intersection, do a web search, and determine that possibly the driver of the car is a 50-year-old man who has a family, and the person in the intersection is a 50-year-old man who does not have a family. Could you use that information to make a decision? Could you convert that information algorithmically into a part of your score? So let's personalize this for me, right? We can start to see what my score would look like. I would receive about 45 because I'm about, let's say, 55 years old. I would receive 45 points for my age, which would make my life worth more than someone who was 80-year old and would receive only 20 points, but worth less than someone who is 25-year old and would receive only 75 points. And then I don't smoke, so I would still have my 55 points. But what if the 25-year-old was a smoker? You might say, look, smoking takes away 10 points in our algorithm, right? And then what about something else? What if you could determine through this facial recognition education levels? What if one person has a PhD and the other person has no education at all? Does that difference count? Does that make one life worth more than another? Now remember, what does worth more mean? Worth more means simply happier. That's it. Within this theory, one life is worth more than another if it will produce more happiness than another life. So that's why we would say, look, assuming everything else is equal, a younger person has more happiness left in his or her days than an older person. So that's why the younger person lives. Um, Thinking about education. Does education make you happier? I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Some people say ignorance is bliss, and sometimes I think they're right. Um, so you would have to think that through. Um, but it would be if you could um, get this facial recognition to work quickly enough and find information on Google. You certainly could for me, for example. If the Tesla was coming at me and could do facial recognition. My face is all over the internet. It would not be difficult for the car to identify who I am. And then my educational background is also all over the internet. My resume is a public webpage. And as it happens, I have a PhD in philosophy. Now, does that make my life happier? I'm not sure. That's a good question. It's difficult to say, but that would be something you could include in the algorithm. So we have what kinds of numbers go into this algorithm? We have something like age, we have something like education, we have something like family members. Uh, what if a person is in a wheelchair? So imagine the case that two people are exactly identical. same age, same family, same education, but one of those two is in a wheelchair. Does that make a difference in which one you choose? And remember, the choice is made exclusively in terms of happiness. Are you happier if you are in the wheelchair or not in the wheelchair? If you can answer that question, then you can answer the question about which life is worth more according to this theory. The life that you would choose, you just choose that for yourself. Say, would you like to have your life as it is or in a wheelchair? Um, Whatever choice you make, that's the choice of the life which is worth more because it has greater happiness attached to it. Now, as we've said, there are different theories like the dignity theory, which would conflict with that. But once I got you on this slippery slope, once I got you to admit that some lives are worth more than others by comparing the 95-year-old and the baby, once I got you on that slope, now you have to answer the question, would you choose to live as you live now or to have your same life but in a wheelchair? And whichever one of those two things you choose is the better life by this theory. And that's something the Tesla car could see. So if you choose, I suspect many people would choose to not be in a wheelchair. They think my life would be happier if I could walk and run instead of being paralyzed and unable to walk. Most people would say that the walking life is happier than the life of the paralytic. Um, I believe most people would say that. And that's something that the Tesla car could easily see with its cameras. So in this algorithm, the Tesla, by this logic, would discount or take away points for someone because they were smoking, because they were in a wheelchair, because they were older. It would give points because they were younger, because they have a family. Would it give points because someone appears healthier in terms of their weight? Would it give or take away points because someone appears wealthier? Maybe the cameras could quickly make a judgment based upon the clothes someone is wearing about their relative wealth level. Would that be part of the algorithm? I'm not sure. These are difficult questions, but they are the kinds of questions that are forced by this theory. Now, once you grade life in terms of the amount of happiness it will produce, and that's what utilitarianism does. It says, look, the better life is the one that has more happiness, because that's all that matters is happiness, maximizing happiness or minimizing suffering. Once you do that, then you do have a logic and a potential algorithm for a driverless car to make life and death decisions. And the way that algorithm would work is by assigning value to each human life. And again, it assigns that value in terms of the happiness that it possesses. And then concretely, we've seen ways that the camera in the online link could do that. Simple ways, younger life is happier than an older life. More complex ways, a life of someone who is not smoking is worth more than the life of someone who is smoking. Again, because presumably the happiness of the non-smoker is higher than the happiness of the smoker. Though maybe that's not true, right? This is where the debates would come in. But what is not debatable is the idea that an algorithm could be produced to give the value of human lives in terms of a number. And those numbers can be stacked up as a hierarchy. And that hierarchy can be used, and in fact, must be used by a company like Tesla to make a decision about who will live and who will die when an autonomous vehicle is in a situation where someone must die. Now, I say it must be used. I mean, it must be used once you take that first step, once you agree with me that the life of the baby is worth more than a 95-year-old, or once you agree with me that one life can be worth more than another. Once you take that first step, then you're stuck going all the way down, right? And if you take that first step and you work at Tesla, then the kind of work, part of the work you would need to do, if you're working in the autonomous car division, is come up with this kind of theory. How can lives be ranked in terms of numbers so that the car, when it has to decide, can decide to save the life of the higher ranked person in terms of how much happiness they have and will have in the future? Okay, so that is the Tesla case. Here's a quick screenshot of what it looks like when I do this in my seminars, and so you can see there's lots of different factors that we consider. Um, Among them, we consider also people's height. Does your height make a difference? If people are equal in every way and one person is taller than another, is that person happier or less happy? What about beauty, attractiveness? Should we save an attractive person because their life is happier than someone who is not attractive? If we're only talking about happiness, it seems like you can make a fairly strong case that yes, this is something people don't like about the theory. People become very uncomfortable with the theory of consequentialism and utilitarianism when they have to make this kind of decision, when they have to say that one life should be saved for another just because that person is going to be more happy. But that's what the theory is. And as I say, the advantage is that it does give a way to make real decisions in the world in numerical terms. That's extremely important. Okay. And then there are just some quick meta questions we could ask. When one of them is the question, I mean, is human life itself happy? I have been assuming that. So when I say that we should save the baby instead of the 95-year-old, that assumes that life itself is happy. But there are philosophers like Schopenhauer who believe that life is fundamentally unhappy and that life is fundamentally suffering in that the balance of every day, a typical day, is more bad than good, right? So if that's true, I mean, if you believe that, if you believe life is more unhappy than happy, is more suffering than pleasure overall, then you would reverse everything, and then you would say, well, look, in that case, it's better for the car to hit the baby and leave the 95-year-old to live, because the less you live, the better it is, since life is suffering. So that's an interesting twist on this case. Um, and then just a second meta question is people frequently ask whether or not computers can be ethical. My suspicion is that they cannot because they cannot have intentions. They cannot understand why they make decisions. But if you want to make the argument that they can be ethical, the machines can act as ethical agents in the world, then this might be the place you would want to go because this is the best opportunity that you have for using the tools that make machines work, um, rendering everything as numbers and making quick decisions with lots of data. This is the best opportunity you have, I think, for an area where it would appear that machines could, in fact, make better decisions than humans. I mean, again, just going back to the start, we said in this kind of situation where the brakes in a car fail, humans in that kind of situation will panic and it, our minds will be overwhelmed. We will not be able to make a good decision about where the car should go and who should be hit um, when the brakes fail. Whereas by contrast, the AI, yes, it will be able to make a well-reasoned and patient decision because we can prepare for it and we can do it right now. Right? We don't need to wait until the accident is going to happen to make the decision. We can do the algorithm and construct the algorithm right now and make the car obey those rules. Um, so this would be an area where you could, I'm not saying that I would, but one could make the argument where the machine is ethical and perhaps it acts as an ethical agent even more vigorously than a human being.